Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland, and here I am outside Her Majesty's Prison, Reading, in the United Kingdom. I'm pointing out to the UK just in case there's a Reading in another part of the world. I'm virtually sure there is. So, anyway, really I'm filming here because this is where Oscar Wilde spent a couple of the unhappiest years of his life, from 1895 to 1897. You may know that his undoing started in February 1895 when the Marquis of Queensberry went to Wilde's club and left a note on the notice board saying, "For Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite." Yes, he really did misspell it, meaning sodomite, but the implication was unmissable. So Wilde then unwisely took out an action for criminal libel, which then existed against Lord Queensberry because he had wrecked Wilde's reputation. He'd satisfied the various conditions for libel. He had written something and he published it to a third party, as in anyone other than Lord Queensberry himself and Oscar Wilde could read this, and it was damaging to Wilde's reputation, and Wilde asserted it was false. But anyway, the libel action collapsed. So anyway, I want to go into the prison. Let's see if we can go into the prison. Hey, can we come in? Come on, open up. We're planning an escape. We want to help somebody escape from prison. Open up. They're not opening up. Oh well. All right. It closed in 2013. That's what I can do this. Maybe looking like it's seen better days. And look at this old car park. Okay, so they put these bollards there so you can't park your car. What would be wrong with people parking their cars? It's completely disused. But anyway, on to Oscar Wilde's time here. We'll maybe have a walk around the perimeter of the prison. So don't want to tell you too much about the trial, but his libel action collapsed as prosecuted because he found that the defence, Lord Queensberry's barristers, had found plenty of young men who were willing to swear on oath that they engaged in what were then known as unnatural acts with Oscar Wilde. So and then Wilde was prosecuted. I think they failed to reach a verdict sometime, but there was a second trial when he was convicted in R and Wilde. So he was sent down. So for the prosecution there was Edward Carson, his former friend from Trinity College Dublin. So I think it was Wilde who said that he prosecuted the case with all the added bitterness of a former friend. Not sure quite why they've fallen out, maybe over this one, because obviously homosexuality was illegal and the Offences Against the Person Act 1861 made gross indecency punishable by 2 years hard labour. Gross indecency being any sexual contact between two males. Now there was what was then described in Henrician legislation as the most detestable act of buggery, but he wasn't convicted of that, nor indeed was prosecuted for that. That would have attracted a rather harsher sentence. Anyhow, so Wilde was found guilty in May 1895, so it took 3 months from his foolish libel action to him being sent down. And he was tipped off. He could have run away. They're coming to arrest him. He was in a hotel. Friends urged him to get the boat train to France. It's in a train that was scheduled to arrive at a port on time to catch a ferry to France, but he declined to do so. So he faced the music. And he was held in Pentonville Prison, then in Newgate Prison, which is subsequently demolished, which is the site of what's now the Old Bailey. That's the United Kingdom's largest and most celebrated court. And somewhere else, I can't remember where else. Was it Brixton, one of those? He was transferred by Clapham Junction, and he was there chained to a prison officer wearing his prison uniform, and he was recognised by the crowd and jeered and spat at for about half an hour till he managed till his train came. So he wept every day in remembrance of this monstrous public humiliation he had faced. So the beak on the bench who'd sent him down said the 2-year sentence was manifestly inadequate to punish offences as heinous as his. And another man was sent down with him. Now, because Wilde had a relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, who was one of Lord Queensberry's younger sons, Bosie, as he was known. Lord Alfred Douglas was not prosecuted. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it was just his upper-class credentials meant we're not going to do this. They may have think that Wilde corrupted him. When Wilde met Bosie, Oscar Wilde was 38 and Bosie was 21, so there was no sense that Bosie was a child. Nevertheless, Wilde was considerably older than him. But And just being young was also not a defence to these things, because some rent boys who were well underage these days were jailed for their activities. These days we do them as a victim, but back then it didn't matter. Like there's a Cleveland Street scandal. Usually if it was a man over 21 with a man under 21, both parties are prosecuted, but the younger one got more harshly punished on the basis that he'd led the other one into carnal lust. Oh yes, and here we see this silhouette image of Oscar Wilde as a bit of a poser with his hat. Here's a bit of the Thames that flows through Reading, one branch of it. Okay, so this prison was erected in 1844, and it became by 1992 it was a remand centre. It was for young offenders, as in people sent to prison under the age of 18. He spent 2 miserable years here, and there was solitary confinement. The idea was to break people mentally, give them plenty of time to reflect upon their wickedry and to become penitent. So they're only given the Holy Bible and Pilgrim's Progress for reading material. So he wrote numerous letters. He'd been visited by a Liberal MP who was a friend of his. By this stage, Wilde, it's not widely known, was fascinated by politics, and that's why he wrote The Soul of Man under Socialism. He was attracted to socialism, but he wasn't really going to advocate it. Of course, it would be the kiss of death for him to endorse an ideology in those days, because there was so much homophobia at the time. And he had to wear a mask whenever he was outside a cell. All prisoners did, so they could have no face-to-face contact, they could have no friendship. And as you can imagine, that was incredibly dispiriting for someone as gregarious and as extraordinarily extroverted as he was. So he could send and receive letters. He wrote De Profundis, was an extremely long letter, but he wasn't permitted to send that. De Profundis is in From the Depths, which is the beginning of a Catholic prayer, and it's not widely appreciated that he was baptized as a Catholic as well as into the Church of Ireland, and he'd received into the Catholic Church just before he died. So he had to spend hours picking oakum and on the treadmill, completely useless exercises. So the sheer futility of it was obviously mind-numbing and enormously frustrating. And so that was part of the punishment. And they received very little to eat, very bland food. And he was used to the finest dining, because he was a very wealthy man, although he spent a fortune as legal defence, hiring the finest barristers in the realm. But that still didn't get him off. And then his wife had left him. They never divorced. Divorce is a very slow, expensive, and seemingly shameful process in those days. Divorce was very rare indeed. But he never met his wife and children again. And then he discovered that she had a severe back problem. His sons, they were simply told that their father was ill, so their surname was changed to Holland, which was a family name on the mother's side. Well, her maiden name had been Lloyd, so that people wouldn't connect them with Oscar Wilde. It's quite an unusual name. It's a Dutch name because his family had moved from the Netherlands to Ireland with William of Orange, something that most people in Ireland would prefer to overlook. So you can see one of the main buildings of it. You can see a bit of the chapel, that central tower there in Reading Gaol. And whilst he was there was a guy called Wilde, a cavalry soldier who'd murdered his wife in a fit of jealous rage. But despite this being crime passionnel, he was nevertheless sentenced to death. And Oscar Wilde describes that very vividly and poignantly in his magnificent poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol. It's surely the most famous prison in this country, perhaps in the world, solely on the strength of that one poem. I can't think of any other notable poems which are about prison life, and how he's going to be executed, saying, talking about that tent of blue that prisons call the sky. I mean, up there, not very blue today, and saying how that was whispered, that fella's got a swing, as in that guy Wooldridge is going to be executed. Although there's some slight mistakes in the poem about exactly how the murder took place or where it took place. Was she in bed or was she on the street? I don't recall, because he suspected his wife of having an affair, but I think wrongly as well, just to make it even more tragic. So he was the man was executed and dumped into a quicklime grave. So quicklime, this chemical, I can't remember the proper scientific name for it, as in to completely dissolve the body so there'd be just no remains, just be mush within a few hours, so long as the corpse is dry. A mistake that Dr. Harvey Crippen made a generation later. And even in chapel, they were in sort of separate cubicles. They couldn't see each other. They could sing the hymns, but not to speak. But they had a way of pretending to sing hymns, but actually speaking a bit of conversation. How long have you been in for? Some sort of human contact. And children and adults were not separated in prison in those days, and sometimes if children had to share cells with adults, they'd be severely beaten up, and worse. I shan't spell it out. And then there was a child prisoner in there for some petty larceny, and he was malnourished. I'm not sure why, with other prisoners somehow stealing his food, and one of the prison officers took pity on this famished child and gave him some biscuits, and that was discovered by the prison governor, and the prison officer was sacked for his act of mercy towards a malnourished child. Kind of thing that really horrified Wilde. As you know, he was very fond of children. He wrote children's stories like The Happy Prince, The Selfish Giant, and so forth. So, and then in 1897, after 2 years, he was released, and the authorities had the decency to release him at dawn because they never did the waiting press pack. I mean, cameras didn't work fast enough to snap a photo of him, but they'd like to see him, try to interview him, just write something about his demeanour upon leaving the penitentiary, but they were denied that chance. He was happy to evade the reptiles, and he went immediately to France. He never returned to Ireland or Great Britain in his life. He visited Italy as well. His wife had the money, I think some family money. She was giving him £4 a week, which was a lower middle class salary to live off. So there he was in Paris. Napoleonic lands suited him, France and Italy, because the Napoleonic Code had abolished the law against homosexuality. It's still very much disapproved of, but there was no law against it. So then he hooked up with Bosie again, and then resumed their relationship. But Bosie was sort of a sociopathic, selfish, and unfeeling as ever before. So really, he was the cause of Oscar Wilde's destruction. So they spent some time in southern Italy. They passed through Rome, where Wilde composed poems at the graves of John Keats and Percy Bysshe Shelley, two radicals in their way. Shelley more so than Keats, but two sort of outcasts from society. Obviously, for Wilde, been rather different because he'd been lionised by London society for a long time. He'd been the toast of every theatre goer, and then he had the most spectacular fall from grace. And so his wife was in Germany trying to get an operation for her back, and said, but the subvention she's giving him, £4 a week, that's conditional on her not resuming his relationship, with Bosie. But she discovered that Oscar Wilde had recommenced his liaison with Lord Alfred Douglas, so she cut him off without an ob. But then her operation for her back went wrong and she died, and he wasn't given custody of the children because of his supposed low moral character. So he spent the end of his life in Paris. Nobody would publish any of his works. They wouldn't touch him. And he wasn't really poor, but he was certainly not living high in the hog as he had been before. He was good friends with Ronald Ross, this British-Canadian chap from a political family, and became his literary executor, and who'd always adored Wilde. I mean, in the carnal sense as well. But Wilde never had any relationship with him. Wilde, perhaps a man of rather poor taste, had gone for Bosie. Anyway, so he died there in Saint-Germain-des-Clercs or Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris, in Hôtel d'Alsace, in 1900, the age of 46. I don't remember which graveyard he was initially interred in, but he was exhumed and reburied about a decade later in Père Lachaise Cemetery, with that huge statue by Epstein of some sort of flying angel character, which actually had a membrum virile on it for a long time. So I think it was hacked off. It was doubtful that big statue was ever going to be put up because it was so expensive, the stone. There was going to be a big import tax to pay on the stone itself. But I think the French authorities waived that in the end. So there he is. And at least one of his sons was present at the exhumation and reburial of Oscar Wilde. So Ronald Ross did much to blazon forth Oscar Wilde's reputation posthumously. It was several years after Wilde's death before any theatre would perform any of his plays again. And I can't remember which wag quipped that Oscar Wilde was a tale of Sodom and Gomorrah, as in he's Irish and was a homosexual. Because in stage Irishry we supposedly say Begorra, but it's a sort of portmanteau of Sodom and Gomorrah, as in those two cities in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, where men were supposedly engaged in same-sex relations. So that's just a little bit about Oscar Wilde at Her Majesty's Prisons, Reading, Oscar's Diner, as an acquaintance of mine called it, when he was there for fraud in 1990. So hasn't had so many distinguished inmates since. Some the Irish volunteers were there after 1916 Easter Rising, and I can't think of anyone else particularly notable who cooled his heels here for a couple of years. Anyway, so on platform 10 at Clapham Junction Station, you can see the plaque to commemorate what happened to Wilde there, and tens of thousands of men, gay men like him, had their convictions was it overturned, will not be the word, pardoned, wiped a couple of years ago, because obviously in 1967 England and Wales abolished the law against homosexual acts. Scotland followed suit in 1979 and Northern Ireland in 1982. So that is Wilde. It's in the grounds of what was Reading Abbey, but that's another video here. Here's a Catholic church, and I know he was a Catholic definitely towards the end of his life, but there was an Anglican chapel in there. There might have been a Catholic priest going in there for the Catholic prisoners. But that was one of their few excuses to get out of the cell. So you should read the Ballad of Reading Gaol. Read it aloud. It takes about an hour to declaim. Obviously it's absolutely magnificent, but whilst he was detained he had plenty of time to compose it mentally and write it down once he was set at liberty. So that's Oscar Wilde, who died too soon. I warmly recommend to you that film Wilde with Stephen Fry in the title role. As somebody said, Stephen Fry was born to be wild, and he's quite like him, you know, 6'4", gay, and not completely English. I mean, Fry is Austrian Jewish on his, or is it even Hungarian Jewish on his mother's side. Obviously Wilde was Irish, but had Dutch and English ancestry several generations before. Okay, that's enough from Reading Gaol. So I hope you like what you saw, so please subscribe to me and follow me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. I really need donations to keep the channel going, so kindly donate most liberally on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. That's all small letters, Callahan spelt C-A-L-L-A-G-H-A-N. Toodaloo.